Hello, everybody. This is Glenn Loury, host of The Glenn Show, and I'm with Paul Starr. It's my pleasure to be speaking with Paul today. He is one of the most distinguished sociologists and scholars in the country whose work has helped shape our modern understanding of public life. Paul is the Stewart Professor of Communications and Public Affairs at Princeton. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and co-founder of the American Prospect magazine. His career has spanned the sociology of medicine, the evolution of media systems, the history of liberalism, and complex ways that institutions adapt or fail to adapt to social change. I think it's fair to say that few thinkers have traced the architecture of American society with more clarity or breadth than has Paul. He has a new book. It's called American Contradiction, Revolution, and Revenge from the 1950s to Now, and it offers an ambitious narrative of the last 7 decades of American history. Paul argues that the story of modern America is not simply one of progress or decline, but of continual tension between movements pushing for greater equality and freedom on the one hand, and forces resisting those changes in defense of an older order. It's a book about democracy, identity, political backlash, and the fragility of the liberal institutions that hold our society together. And I can say that whether one agrees with every turn of the argument or not, it's a work that challenges us to think more deeply about how we arrived at this moment, this perilous moment that we're living in, and where we might be headed next. With that, Paul, thank you very much for joining me. I'm delighted to talk with you about the ideas in your book.
Well, Glenn, I am happy to be with you, and I appreciate that explanation of my work and of this book, and the kind of criticism that you have for it. I'm very pleased to be able to engage with you about it.
Paul, you're an old liberal. Are times passing us by? I call myself a conservative from time to time, although the conservatives don't seem to agree with me about that. But we've been around for a while, both of us, and I'm just wondering, everything seems to be up in the air these days in our democratic political life, and I'm just wondering how it looks from your perspective.
It's very troubling. It's very disturbing. I nonetheless, have this underlying faith in the country. This book is about the contradiction that I think, begins with the very founding of the country, the contradiction between freedom and slavery. We've had these battles throughout our history that take in different forms. The one we've been working our way through now is different from earlier ones, but there's this basic continuity in the country's history, and as hard as things are, I still believe if we look past, there's encouragement, there are lessons to be taken, and there's a basis for hope. So I'm not gonna be saying everything is doomed.
Okay, now revolution or revenge, the dynamic of interaction between revolution and revenge. What led you to this particular way of looking at things, and how do you see it playing out in our current public life?
Yeah, so the narrative in the book falls into 2 parts. And the first half of the story, the first half of the book is called American Revolutions of the 20th Century. And by that, I mean, in particular, the Black freedom struggle, the feminist movement, and what was originally the gay rights movement. But each of those attempted to rectify historic injuries, historic injustices, historic inequalities, and each of them produced a backlash. And the first half of the book ends with a chapter called Half a Counter-Revolution. And that is about the counter movements from Nixon through Reagan. But only half a counter-revolution, I argue, because although we did see increasing economic inequality. The movements that had begun in the mid 20th century, these movements to deal with these historic inequalities, they continue. They were not reversed. The basic precedents, the historic precedents that had been set in the Supreme Court under Earl Warren, most of those precedents held, and so we ended up in this period with growing economic inequality, but still commitments to increased social inequality, social equality. And in the second half of the book, I call sleepwalking into revenge, and by that I'm referring to a series of choices that we made, that is, that the country made, choices about free trade, for example, and deregulation, choices about immigration, where in many cases, I don't think people really understood the implications, didn't understand what the effects would be. And those developments had mixed effects, had different effects on different people, and ended up, I think, contributing to what has now become, under Donald Trump, a movement for revenge. So I don't treat that term revenge in regard to the earlier backlash. I think it's specifically about what's happening today.
You know, I wanted to ask you about that, about revenge, because it's very normative. I mean, you know, revolution and revenge. Is revolution always good? Is a lament at the changes occasioned by revolution always bad? Does the desire to conserve pre-existing order and social understanding necessarily constitute an evil thing that needs to be overcome? You know, I mean, what do you think about that?
So I do believe that those movements that I refer to, the civil rights movement, feminist movement, the gay rights movement, I do believe they were fundamentally just. That's not to say every facet of them deserves our approval, but I don't want to turn my back on them. I think those made America a better place, a better country, more consistent with the highest ideals that our country has honored. So in that sense, you know, I don't want to, you know, say they were a mistake. I'm not saying, on the other hand, that the reaction against them was always the result of prejudice or nostalgia, because I'm not, because there were problems that people experienced. That's why, and it's more in the second half of the book that I talk, you know, about the losses that were sustained, and those losses were especially sustained by the many people who had, the way I put it in the book is, they had working class jobs but middle class incomes, and they had gotten that in the mid 20th century in the big manufacturing industries. They had gotten that in part through the work of unions that had raised their wages, and those were undercut, and they were at the losing end of change. And so, and by that I don't just mean, you know, if you look at data on stagnant incomes and so forth, but and then this is where the sociologist in me comes out. When you look at all of the social consequences, family breakup, and drug addiction, and other kinds of problems, and what I suggest in the book, there were kind of two clear waves, and I get this, by the way, in part from my colleagues, the economist Angus Deaton, his wife Ann Case, in their work on deaths of despair. And they make the argument that this happened in two waves, that when deindustrialization began in the mid-70s and the 80s, it really had its most devastating consequences on Black communities, and that Black workers were the first to lose out in this process. And then in the early 2000s, and this is particularly in the wake of the China shock, that same process, that same sequence unfolded in many white working class communities in the Midwest, in particular, but other regions as well. And so there were losses of jobs, but also a lost grip and many people on security and expectations about being able to raise a family, and that had consequences for family structure. It had consequences, for drug use. So in the earlier phase, there had been an increase with crack cocaine and heroin, and the second phase was more with opioid. But the argument is these were parallel processes, and so the economic damage spread into communities and took other forms as well.
Is this a uniquely American phenomenon that you're identifying here? The back and forth between liberatory struggle on the one hand and institutional resistance to change on the other. Do you see it in Western Europe, in South Asia and India and so on?
Many people have raised this question for me. And the answer is yes, there are similarities to things that have happened elsewhere. That's not in my, I'm talking about what happened in the United States. If I had done more work and written 200 more pages, I could have got into the extent to which this same process took place in other countries. And I do think there are parallels. I don't do that in this book. I'm telling a story about the United States, but if what you're implying is it wasn't unique to the United States, that's absolutely true. But I do think there are some things that are distinctive about the United States. And one is the history of slavery and the regional and racial and other divisions that have been legacies of that history. And then another thing I think that's different about the United States is that we have still an 18th century constitution that is very hard to amend. And we have certain entrenched structures, like the Electoral College, the structure of the U.S. Senate, and so forth. These are institutions that most other democracies don't have anymore. Most Western democracies do not have an unrepresentative upper house of the legislature. They don't have anything like an Electoral College. I mean, they've got their own problem, but we have certain distinctive institutions in this country, and they have had a particular effect on the way in which these questions are developed. So I do believe if we had different political institutions, if we had a system of proportional representation and no Electoral College, I think actually the history of the last 30 years would have been different.
Do you know who funds the websites where you get your news? How often have they been wrong in their reporting? What kinds of stories do they consistently leave out of their coverage? These are important questions. You can find out the answers at Ground News. It's the website and app I rely on daily to stay informed, cut through the noise, and to get closer to the truth. Visit ground.news/Glenn Show to see for yourself how it works. My favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. About 20 such stories every day. Here's a curious example I see in the blind spot for the left section. Senator Mark Warner says, uniformed military may help save us from President Trump. Warner said this on MS Now, formerly MSNBC, obviously a left-wing channel, but this quote became a story, not for the left, but for the right. As I'm recording this, all coverage of this as a standalone story has come from the right. Meanwhile, here's a story that predictably only gets play on the left. Trump appears to fight sleep in cabinet meetings after attacking scrutiny by the media of his age. For both of these and for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of the sources covering it, the bias of the media outlets reporting across the left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. This is the kind of news analysis you won't find anywhere else. Right now, my viewers can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, which is the same plan I use. Make sure you subscribe using my link at ground.news/Glenn Show. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/Glenn Show.
One of the things that intrigued me in your book was your identification of the Black freedom struggle as a kind of model minority exemplar of a template for change for other groups. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes.
I want to ask more generally, how is the founding of the country and as a slave republic relevant in the 21st century now, well past the advent of the civil rights movement? How do you see the racial question still coloring, American politics?
So the civil rights movement was contesting the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. They hadn't disappeared by the mid-20th century. And so that is how this whole process that I'm talking about in this book began. And I believe that struggle, the Black freedom struggle, in its various forms, I talk about the different forms it took, the direct action civil rights movement of Martin Luther King. That's one form along the way. But that struggle as a whole acquired a great deal of moral capital. Because many Americans, came to recognize the contradiction, came to recognize that the treatment of Black people in America had been inconsistent all along with the ideals that Americans professed. And the legislation, the Civil Rights Act, the judicial precedents that were established as a result of the work of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Thurgood Marshall and so forth, those precedents not only addressed the issues that Black people would experience, they also actually became precedents for other groups. And so there's this spillover. There's this process by which the achievements of that struggle became a model for not only for other ethnic groups, but also for the feminist movement and also for the gay rights movement. And the effects were in some cases the legislation itself. So I talk about the case of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, including language about discrimination on account of sex. It wasn't actually in the original legislation in the House. And the whole process is ironic as to how it got into the law. It was actually on the floor of the House that Southern segregationists proposed what they probably thought would be a poison
They
pill.
thought it was going to kill it.
Yeah. So they added it to the bill. And originally, the Johnson administration asked Democrats in Congress, don't pass this amendment, because they were afraid it was going to kill the bill. But it did pass. The amendment passed with the votes of Southern segregationists, who then voted against the bill as a whole. But that's how sex discrimination got into the Civil Rights Act. So there's this irony, but then it had an enormous impact. And the National Organization of Women only got established afterward. It hadn't existed before. There was no agitation beforehand by a women. There was really no women's movement before the bill, but it develops after as a result of the Civil Rights Act. So, so there are particular people. I mentioned the example of Pauli Murray, who was a lawyer, an influence on Thurgood Marshall, worked on desegregation issues, and she then, in the mid-1960s, writes a book about, not a book, an article, legal article, about what she calls Jane Crow. And she's the one who makes the argument that the 14th Amendment can be a basis for new litigation on sex discrimination. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg reads her work and plays a role originally through the American Civil Liberties Union in bringing these cases about sex. There's this analogy that develops between racism and sexism. The whole term sexism gets invented in this period as a parallel with racism. Now, it's not really exactly the same. It's a troubled analogy, but it's the way people came to think about these. So that's the argument about how we get from the Black freedom struggle to what becomes this much broader movement, challenging social subordination in its different forms. And that's what, I mean, it was astonishingly ambitious. There's really no precedent in American history for a movement that's so, has so many different aspects to it in establishing a more equal society. And maybe it was an overreach.
Let's stay with that for a minute. Maybe it
Okay.
was an overreach. That's a concession. And how might it have been an overreach? And I want to ask you about what's going on in our time now. In the same vein, we had the George Floyd summer of 2020, and we're having the Supreme Court in 2023 overturn the Foundation for Affirmative. And now we've got a wholesale assault from the top of the federal government on what they call DEI. Is that the revenge that you were warning us about?
Well, yeah, to some extent, but let's go back. Was it an overreach? So the way I think about this is that if you imagine a military campaign, would any general, would any central headquarters decide to attack on every front at once? It's like, no, of course. You wouldn't do that. But in effect, that's what progressives did in, beginning in this period in the 1950s and 60s, and one struggle led to another, and it became a kind of comprehensive assault on what many Americans felt to be, the natural order. Not that it really was a natural order, but people often feel that the inherited social order is a kind of natural order. And so I don't think it should be surprising that there was a powerful backlash against this. I don't think it necessarily had to lead to the point that we're at today, where there is this response, and I use the word revenge and the word retribution, because those are terms that Donald Trump uses. And he uses them, he says, I will be your retribution. Well, what is that for? And I think he's telling his followers that he can be the retribution for all the injuries that they have suffered at the hands of liberalism. At least that's how I interpret it. And it's against all of these changes that have upset the traditional form of social life in the country.
You're, I assume, still on the editorial board at the American Prospect.
I do. I retain a title there. I'm not as actively involved as I used to be.
Well, what I'm trying to gesture at is the intellectual heft of the pushback against this revenge.
Yes.
And, the Democrats seeming to be a little bit deer in the headlights, kind of startled by what's going on politically all around them. I know that the off-year election cycle was a favorable outcome in New Jersey and Virginia and New York City. But I don't know that the prospects look all that bright going forward politically, and I'm wondering what you think about that, and about the infrastructure, the intellectual infrastructure of the pushback. Is it up to to your exacting standards? And Ezra Klein's been getting a lot of flack about abundance and about his relatively conciliatory reaction to the turmoil around the killing of Charlie Kirk. The voice of the Democrats, where is it? Who is it? You see what I'm getting at? I mean, the quality on the left of American, broadly speaking, left of the American political spectrum of countering the forces of revenge that you've identified.
Well, you've raised a lot of different questions here, but let's just go back. How do I see, what's happened in the last couple of elections and the state of politics? And I just say, going back to the 1990s, we've had a series of very close national elections, close presidential elections, and close close congressional elections. 2000 is the clearest case of that. We have two presidential elections, 2000, 2016, that were decided in the Electoral College, where the loser of the popular vote became president. And we've had, Congress, both houses of Congress being held by a party by very slim margins. It's 3 seats in the House now and 4 seats in the Senate. This has not been a period when either party has been overwhelmingly dominant. Control has shifted back and forth many times of each House of Congress and the president. I don't think we should make too much of any single election. It's really, if you just look at the period as a whole, it's been very close to a tie game. But what I've also said, it's been a tie game that Democrats have been losing. It's close, but Republicans have had the edge. When Democrats have been in office, first of all, each Democratic president of the last 30 years, Clinton and Obama and Biden, each one of them lost control of Congress at the first midterm election. And we haven't had a period when a party had sustained control of the White House, because it's gone back and forth. So it's been very hard for Democrats to carry out a substantial agenda. And perhaps just as important, the Supreme Court has shifted into a decisively conservative majority, supermajority, really. And that has changed a great deal. It's the background factor behind so much of what's happening right now, where President Trump can do things that an earlier Supreme Court would have stopped him from doing. So this is the way I see it. They've been very tight. We have this combination of very divided, sharply divided parties, but closely divided parties, very closely matched. And the result is each election can seem to swing things violently in another direction. And it's very unstable. This is not a period where other countries can count on a consistent foreign policy of the United States. On so many issues, things will just careen back and forth. And even 2024, although President Trump represents it as a landslide, the difference in the popular vote was 1.5%. This was actually a very close election. And so in our most recent elections in 2025, just this past month, we had about roughly a 6% shift. And if that's true next November, it's probably going to give at least the House back to the Democrats. And then who knows what happens in 2028. Assuming we're still a democracy and we have fair elections. But
do you really think it possible not so? You said the Supreme Court. Would the Supreme Court sit idly by while the processes of democratic representation were usurped? I mean, I want to say no, I can't imagine that, but you know something I don't?
I don't think we can make assumptions that used to be just common sense in this country. I don't know how violent things might get. So I just, as I said at the very beginning, I said I have this basic confidence in the country, but I don't know what's going to happen in the short run.
Is the mobilization of anti-immigration law enforcement through the Trump administration's Department of Homeland Security and so on ostensibly undertaken to get control of the border and have a say about who comes into, quote, our country, close quote, revenge act? And revenge against what?
Yeah, so I think, I think Trump has effectively promised his voters that he was going to undertake this massive effort at deporting people in the United States who've come here without legal authorization or overstayed visas. He's not, it's interesting, he's not going to the agricultural areas where so much of the workforce consists of illegal aliens. He's leaving that alone because we'd have lots of other problems if he was deporting those workers. Instead, he's choosing to send enforcement into Democratic cities, blue states. I think it's clearly not just about the immigrants. It is also an act of political revenge. And it's an attempt to intimidate. So, sending in federal troops in situations where there's really no cause for them to be brought in, whether it was Los Angeles or Chicago. This is not something we really have any experience with.
Well, pushback. So crime is a serious problem in some of these cities. Trump has deployed National Guard in D.C. and Memphis. He talks about Chicago. Of course, the Democrats in Illinois are very resistant to that. But if you ask people on the ground in these communities, often you hear them saying what a relief it is to be able to, walk up and down the street without fear about criminal victimization and stuff like that.
Well, we have a tradition of, we actually have laws that say that the military is not supposed to be used for police purposes. I mean, this is completely out of line with our history.
Oh,
so
okay,
maybe
this is where your Supreme Court is failing to enjoin the executive.
Yeah. I just don't think that's an appropriate function for the U.S. military.
Okay, let me ask you another question. Are sanctuary cities an expression of revenge against the imposition of the federal government's enforcement of immigration laws? Are they rightly likened to the standing in the schoolhouse door resistance of southern jurisdictions to the imposition of the civil rights?
No, that is not a good analogy, because in this case, immigrants are here illegally, and providing sanctuary to them is not the same as trying to enforce the Civil Rights Act. So no, I'm not going to make that equation. But we have been, the background to this, however, is that we have been stuck. We have been stalemated for decades now on dealing with the population of roughly, I don't know, 10 million, 12 million, not sure what the exact figure would be now, of people who are here in the United States without authorization. Many of them have been here for decades. And they have paid their taxes, they're law-abiding citizens. Do we really want to disrupt the families and communities by deporting them en masse? That's a legitimate question, and we should have dealt with it in the past with legislative reforms, but we haven't. And that's why those cities have passed those rules. But it's still the fact, if somebody is here illegally, they are legally subject to deportation. There's no question about that.
I asked earlier whether or not you thought the revolution, revenge, contradictory cycle applied in other countries. And we're talking now about immigration, and I'm thinking about the impact of immigration, broadly speaking, in Europe, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, in France, and the rise of populist right-of-center politics in those countries. And it's hard not to see a connection between those two. And it's hard not to think that that's part of what's going on with the success of Trump, such as it has been here in the United States. And it leads me to back to the foundational question about your book, which is whether the cycle of reaction against liberatory movements is necessarily one of good versus evil, and where the reaction might not have a rationale. And in the case at hand about immigration, the rationale would be, I don't want the quality and character of my country's social life to change dramatically in ways over which I feel I have no control, and so on. And I'm wondering if there's any space within your view of things to accommodate that kind of resistance as being consistent with a decency and a kind of political morality. Is nationalism, a concern about the undermining of, quote, our way of life, close quote, always a reactionary sentiment?
Okay, so let me tell you about an article that I wrote specifically on the subject of immigration. And some of this is in the book as well. It was an article in the American Prospect called "The Social Triumph and Political Tragedy of Immigration." And so what I argue there is that I think immigration over these past decades, since the changes that were made in 1965, I think immigration has strengthened the country culturally and economically. But I understand that many people don't see it that way. And it's interesting when you look at the public opinion data on this. First of all, there's still a very deep reservoir of support for immigration, even now. And in 2020, 2021, when Joe Biden was elected, when he came into office, there was actually tremendous support for immigration. I think it was in reaction to what had happened during Trump's first term. His policies was family separation and so forth. And actually those 2 years, 2020 and 2021, show the highest level of support, according to the Gallup surveys, the highest levels of support for immigration over the entire period since 1965. So what happened? What happened during that Biden term? How did he squander what was really a tremendous amount of goodwill toward immigration? I think number one reason is, that he lost control of the border. And the border crisis, I think, convinced many people that immigration was out of control. And what I say in the article is that if you believe immigration has, on the whole, been a good thing for the country, you still have to take into account the people who don't agree with you, who don't think it's a good thing for them. And you have to be able to show them, first of all, that immigration is under control and that people are being vetted, that there's, the proper precautions are being taken. And that you're not going to treat these new immigrants better than you treated the other people. Because I think a lot of people who had come in earlier felt, oh my goodness, all these new immigrants, all these people who came in illegally in 2021 and 22 and so forth, they were being given special benefits, housing or whatever. And so Biden really undermined the that support that he had had at the very beginning of his administration. So what I'm suggesting is that I agree with you to some extent. The views of people who on the other side of these issues absolutely need to be taken seriously. And I don't just dismiss them in the book. I never just say, "Oh, they're racist. Let's not pay attention to them." I think you just have to understand where they're coming from, and that a careful policy, a thoughtful policy, could have sustained the basic support, the goodwill toward immigration that Americans, by and large, have, without having gotten to the point where things broke down and the country turned against those policies.
Why have we been unable to formulate and enact a compromise federal policy on the reality of the fact, as you suggested, that we have millions of unauthorized residents in the country, many of whhom have developed businesses, started families, are working hard, and are on the right side of the law. It's unimaginable. It's an unimaginable affront to human decency that you would uproot and deport all those people. So therefore, some accommodation of their presence amongst us has to be made. Can't we get around a table and work out some sensible, pragmatic resolution of this conflict? It seems to me, at least in principle, it's possible to do so. I'm not an expert, but we could begin to sketch the parameters. But it looks like politically it's impossible to do so, and I'm wondering why that is.
Yeah, well, we did do that in 1986. Ronald Reagan signed a bill that was seen as a compromise of the kind you're talking about. It did give people who had come here without authorization, had obeyed the law, had been in the country at least 5 years, if I remember correctly. They did get a path to citizenship, but ultimately about 3 million did get citizenship on that basis. But I think the conservatives who signed on to that agreement under Reagan felt afterward that they hadn't gotten their part of the deal because many people continued to cross the border illegally. And so, in fact, even though stronger immigration enforcement was part of that compromise, they felt it just didn't work, and they weren't going to sign onto another such compromise. So I think that had a lot to do with the background of this, with the difficulty of reaching an agreement. And I do think we have to put this in a bigger context. There have been and there are going to be massive movements of population around the world. There are sources of instability, poverty, natural disaster, political disaster that impel people in great numbers to leave one part of the world and go to another. That's what has happened across the Mediterranean and affected a lot of those European countries.
Yeah.
And it's happened in this hemisphere, and it's affected the United States. And it's a source of political instability, for us, for those waves of people to arrive in the country. So I don't think there's any easy answer to this. And you can build a wall, and people are still going to figure out ways to get in. But I think the right approach here is that we do need stricter border control at the same time as we find a way to create that path for the people who've been here for a long time. They've lived responsibly. They contribute to the country. Giving them legal status is, I think, important. Actually, not just for them. I think it's important for many others as well, because if you're working in various industries, you don't want to be competing with other people who don't have any legal rights and who can be exploited. It weakens the rights of American citizens if there are non-citizens who get paid under the table, who get paid less.
Yeah.
So we need equal rights across these lines.
Shift the discussion a little bit. You've written a big book about the making of modern American media. And we live in an age where we're obviously in the midst of a profound transition in the media environment, from broadcast to digital platforms and all of that. And you talk about cycles of revenge and revolution and the contradiction in American political life. How does the media environment factor into your thinking about the contradiction question?
I think the changes in the media that have taken place, not just the internet, but even going back earlier to the developments in the 1980s and 1990s when cable television took off, that all of these have helped to fragment the society. They broke up what was once a kind of shared national public. You go back to those days in the post-war period where an astonishing proportion of the public every night watched one of the 3 network news television shows. The same thing was true in newspapers, in large metropolitan newspapers, with readership that crossed political lines. There was more of a shared universe of fact, greater basis of common agreement in the country at that time. And this is, many of us thought at the time there was this increased choice among different channels, more cable channels initially, more FM channels on the radio, et cetera. It all seemed great. It was going to just add to the diversity of the country and satisfy all the different tastes. And I think what we didn't appreciate is that it was fragmenting what had been this shared foundation for public discussion. And it's an irony. Greater consumer choice, great thing, but actually in this case, it had a downside to it. And I think this was already evident by the 1990s, that the development in the media, in radio and TV, initially cable TV, that was leading to this development that everybody describes as polarization. We were getting these separate channels, and that has intensified with the digital developments, with the internet, and it reinforces. I don't think it's the primary cause, but it goes along with the other things that have been dividing us.
Now, I wonder if you'd credit that, although the effects of fragmentation are such as you've described, there's also the idea that it's harder to control the narrative easier to control the narrative when you have only a few portals of news reporting and whatnot, so that the conventional wisdom can command the stage, whereas with everybody with a podcast having a microphone and as many listeners as will log on, it's possible for views that are legitimately deserving of consideration, but outside of the Overton window of acceptable expression, to nevertheless get I'm thinking in particular about people's commentary on the conflict in Israel and Gaza, where, the conventional wisdom is kind of tepid, and use of the word genocide is not something that you're going to find a broadcaster at NBC or MSNBC, for that matter, using. And yet the issues are such that, you could argue that some of these criticisms deserve to be heard. But this is not the only example that one could give of this phenomenon. The phenomenon being there's a party line. The party line gets a kind of monopoly presentation in, quote, mainstream media. But there's independent media, which has crazies, but also has people who are perfectly sensible, but outside of the boundaries of conventional acceptability, and they get a voice.
Len, I don't disagree with you. That's also true. These things have just complex aspects to it. They're not all on one side. But let me just mention one other aspect of the chain,
Okay.
which I think is troubling. And that is, we had in news reporting in the mid-20th century a degree of professionalism, which meant that there was fact-checking, there was an attempt to corroborate sources, and that's been lost. In the system we have now, those institutions have been weakened. Those newspapers that used to exist all across the country, if they still exist, they're just a pale shadow of what they once were. And now it is much easier for false information, for disinformation to spread very rapidly without being checked, as it once was. So I'm not denying that we now have certain viewpoints that didn't used to be well represented, and they are better represented in this new system. That's true. But we've also lost a lot of the sense of editorial responsibility. So, for example, the key decision makers in that old world, the gatekeepers, did have this professional sense of responsibility. And now in the online world, the algorithms don't respond to those norms of professional responsibility. It's just, that algorithmically driven system is much more keyed to conflict, sensationalism. It's just the underlying dynamic now is just so different from what it once was. And I'll grant you there's some good aspects to it, but there's some very troubling ones.
Okay, as we come to conclusion here, I'm put in mind of how you end the book with a call for renewal of liberal democracy. What do you think needs to be done?
Oh my, it's such a huge topic, Glenn. So this book does not have a final chapter that might be described as a solutions chapter. I have a few sentences at the end that I think you're referring to.
You could even just chart the problems, even if we don't have solutions.
Yeah. So we need now to think about how to restrain executive power. We've seen just an astonishing accumulation of power in the presidency. And I think that's partly the result of the Supreme Court's decision, its presidential immunity decision, and other decisions. I hope that at some point in the future, we have a period of constitutional reform. I think about the pardon power, for example, which Trump has used to, in a way, so far beyond anything that we've experienced previously. And you just can't have rule of law if the president can say to people, "Well, violate the law, and then I'll pardon you." The whole system doesn't work. So I'm hoping that at some point we can reconsider certain basic aspects of our constitutional system, in order to achieve the underlying goal of of a more perfect union of a workable republic. And there are lots of other things that I could mention that would go into that. And crucial thing, which is really hard to think through, is how to give working people back the kind of leverage that they had through unions in the mid 20th century. Because there's this huge imbalance of power now, and with the gains from economic growth, from new technologies, flowing to a very few people at the top, and where ordinary people now really are not getting the benefit, and they look at the future. I think many people look at the future as just a threat to their well-being and to the decency of everyday life.
Are you encouraged at all by the fact that a Democratic socialist has just been elected mayor of the country's largest city with a program that I don't think is unfriendly to your way of looking at things?
Well, I'm not a Democratic socialist. I'm a Democrat, but I'm not a socialist. So, but I'm impressed that Zoran Mandami was able to come out of nowhere and run the kind of campaign that he did to excite a lot of voters, especially a lot of young people. Young people are not much excited by a lot of other politicians. So I think his example ought to be one that people look at very carefully and try to figure out, how can they capture, some of that lightning that he had. And it's not going to work. Those politics are not going to work in most of the rest of the country.
Right.
But the kind of campaign and the kind of his ability to connect with a lot of ordinary people, that's something which Democrats ought to be very attentive.
Okay. Now, if you had to distill American Contradiction into one lesson for citizens, one thing that they must understand about sustaining a democratic society in a period of rapid change, what would that be?
You know something? I lost some of what you were saying. I'm afraid the connection dropped.
I said, if you had to take the book, American Contradiction, and distill its teaching into one lesson for a democratic citizenry that would be essential for the democratic renewal that you call for, what would that one lesson be? I'm sorry, it's a pat closing question that I framed before we ever started talking, and I'm just following through.
Okay, so I don't have one lesson.
Yeah, I know. I hate being asked that.
But I do think we need to remember our past. We need to understand where we've come from and be honest about it, be truthful about it, but not be overcome by it, not be doomed by it, believe that we just are condemned to repeat the past. But we need to understand it. We need to learn from it. So that is why I wrote this book. I wrote this book to try to make sense of what has happened in America over roughly the last 3/4 of a century, because it was so astonishing to me when I think about it in retrospect. When I think about the world that we both grew up in, how inconceivable our present America would have seemed. And we went through these two extraordinary changes before Barack Obama was elected. I think most people did not believe Americans were capable of electing a black man president. And before Donald Trump was was elected, I think most people didn't think anybody like him could be chosen to occupy the White House. So the lesson, here's the lesson. This country is capable of surprises. They may not all be good surprises, but we shouldn't feel that just because we're at a particular point in the history that's what we're condemned to, be stuck with. We can create more surprises and maybe, maybe summon the better angels of our nature to create some good surprises.
Sounds good to me. My guest has been Paul Starr. He's professor at Princeton University and author of American Contradiction, Revolution and Revenge from the 1950s to now. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Well, thank you, Glenn.